Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start, and I'll just introduce you, okay? Hello, my name is Deborah Hendricks, and I'm with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program at the University of Florida. Today's date is May 24th, 2022, and we are at the home of Dr. Richard Palmer. Hello, Dr. Palmer.
Hi there.
Okay, and today Dr. Palmer is going to lead us in discussing and giving us stories on what he thinks is important for us to know. Okay, go ahead, Dr. Palmer.
Well, I left off a while ago and realized that I had spent now about 2 years, 2 academic years, and that had been a good start if it had been generally followed the role that I had expected. But things had changed. I had added to my family after I came up here, which caused some bit of economic stress. So at this point in my career, I needed to find a job. And I had advertised around in certain places about need for a job. And a friend of mine from the University of Florida says, well, there is a department, there is a line item open in my department, and I will have you an interview if you're interested. And not having known anything about it, I certainly was interested. And I got an appointment to go into the Seagle Building to be interviewed for a position. And really, I didn't have any idea the position I was going to interview for. However, it turned out, it turned the corner for my life and put me in a position to experience things that are unbelievable to me, and the expectation was not there because I knew nothing about what was going to happen to me in my life. Now, I want to explain that. First of all, the line item that became available had been open for almost 2 years, and it seems that it was waiting on me because I was the first and only person interviewed for the position. It was a position in the University of Florida's Division of Continuing Education. And my life experiences and my education became a new track headed in a different direction. And that direction led me to the experience of the Seagle Building, and the Seagle Building became an inspiration for the TREEO Center. Now, those things have to be developed along the way, and I'll develop them as I go. The entrance into the line item had been open, and I was not interviewed by my direct immediate superior. I was interviewed by the Director of Continuing Education. My person that I was to work for was the Director of Conferences and Institutes, a division of continuing education. And he was on vacation at the time, but the interview was successful. I was given the job or the opportunity to accept, which I did. And at that point, a new world opened up. The world of the life in the Seagle Building. And the Seagle Building had so many things about it in its past history that I think it very well worth discussing. And so it seems like maybe I'm taking a turn to a different direction, but I have to do it to get back the background. First of all, when the Seagle Building was important to the University of Florida, it became important when it was gifted by a Georgia Seagle. The building was originally to be a hotel, and it was started in the Depression, and the man who was building it ran out of money. And locally, he could not find any money because the owner of a local hotel was also the director of the Federal Savings and Loan. And it seems to me that he couldn't get financing, and so a Georgia Seagle bought it, named it the Seagle Building in honor of her deceased brother, John F. Now, the building itself played an extremely large role in a number of activity, and I want to talk about that first. First of all, continuing education at that time was known as the General Extension Division. There was the two most important deans on the campus in the Depression was the dean of the College of Agriculture, and I'm not sure, I believe it was John McCarty, because the McCarty Hall was named after him. He died from a disease that would have been easily cured had we had penicillin at the time. And that relates to me because my brother died of the same problem. If we'd had penicillin, he might still be alive. Well, no, not really, because I'm older than anyone. I'm the member of 7 people, and I'm the baby of 7. And anyway, these experiences, the two most important people were the Dean of General Extension and the Dean of Architecture. Now, General Extension developed the Seagle Building was the house of General Extension, and General Extension played a role in state education because it owned the only and best children's library in the world. And what they would do is that in Florida at that time, there were a number of elementary schools, and I don't know that a single school had its own library. The librarian in those schools, or the person who was responsible for the library, there was never an appointed librarian, but someone in the school would write a list of books that she would like to have for her class throughout the year. And she would send this note with this request to the central office library in the Seagle Building. And those books would be put into a package, and included in it was return postage. They would be sent to the teacher who had requested them, and that was one of the most important parts, or one of the important parts that the Seagle Building played. It also had the first and original museum for natural history, and in fact, the elevator in the Seagle Building, there were 2 elevators, 2 carts, and neither of them had any openings on the 2nd or 3rd floor. The 3rd floor was the first floor was basically occupied by the museum. When the museum moved to campus later, it turned into the Heritage Club. They had a restaurant in the Heritage Club with a grand stairwell that entered. And by the by, this is an aside. Very few people ever knew that there was a running artesian well in the basement of the Seagle Building, which had to be pumped daily. That was a unique feature, and there are other unique things about the building. First of all, the idea that we were in continuing education, the state of Florida had a school in Gainesville that was created in 1853. But somewhere in early 1900s, they were given an offer. In fact, they competed with the normal school in Lake City for the location of the land-grant university. And the Gainesville City Fathers entered into the competition and offered the state free water in perpetuity. And that turned the tide so that the land grant was granted for Gainesville. And in fact, the studies have shown that the physical campus of the University of Florida is large enough to have the whole city of Boston within its boundaries. So that's some idea, gives you some idea of how important the land grant for the university was. There was also at the time a land grant college located in Tallahassee known as Florida A&M. Now, one of the problems that the city fathers experienced later on was that the cost of water started going up because what they had been doing was pumping water out of the artesian, well, the well or the spring of Boulware Springs, and with no treatment. And somewhere when in the Depression, someone decided that there had to be a purifier or a treatment particularly designated as a chlorination of water. And almost no water treatment operator had any idea of what chlorine was or how it was to be put into the water, or the term residual was not even in their vocabulary. So they came to the University of Florida, and a Dr. Black was a chemist on the campus, and he went down to what was known then as Camp Roosevelt. Camp Roosevelt later supplied many of the programs that continuing education became involved in. Camp Roosevelt was located slightly below Bellevue, in an area where the Cross-Florida Barge Canal was to be built. Now, the owners of the engineers in the state of Florida knew at the time there was not enough water flowing through any streams in that part of Florida to last all year. So they built a reservoir in Palatka, and the reservoir has been decommissioned for 20 years, and they can't get it to be shut down. It's still there. And they came finally, the development of a short school or conferences, out of conferences and institute for the teaching of chlorination for water became one of the first emphasis that I can recall. Now, the growth of continuing education came about, or the change that took place, the dean of the Division of Extension was instrumental in the state buying, or the university buying, a piece of property in a triangle down on the West University Avenue, which later became the site. It was intended to be a continuing education center, but it became the site of the president's home, which later was moved down toward Lake Alice. But that was something else that the Seagle Building was famous for. Now, there is one other thing that I want to cover, and I'm not sure that it fits in with what I'm doing because it was so secret. The University of Florida provided a place in the Seagle Building known as the Penthouse, which was above the 10th floor on the Seagle Building, and it became a very secure, secret research center. And in fact, one of the most significant items ever developed by anybody in the United States was developed in the Penthouse in the Seagle Building. In those days, there was no such thing as digital architecture, but they did have electricians who had electrical architecture. And they developed an item known as the Norden bomb sight. The Norden bomb sight was most secretive, and the gentleman, now I'm talking about knowing some of the people that worked in that particular secret laboratory. If I stepped on the elevator, whatever conversation they were having, they ceased. And if they had a book in their hand, they put the title of the book up against themselves so that I couldn't see what they were reading. Now, they had already done the bomb site and also a proximity fuse. Those two items I know as a positive were developed in the Seagle Building. Now, the security came from the fact that if someone tried to invade the Secret Research Center, there was a cage outside the door, securely locked, that you walked into off the elevator. And if that cage was damaged, an attempt was made to enter that room, an alarm would go off at the desk sergeant's desk at the police department, and the only exit to that portion of the world was the interior fire escape. The fastest you could get down the fire escape, it was actually a large concrete column, that a chute, and the stairwells where it was inside the concrete chute that went all the way to the top. And the building was secured and everything was locked down, and the only exit was the concrete stairwell. And the fastest anyone had ever been able to go down the stairwell was 5 minutes. And in 5 minutes, they had a number of troops, police officers, around the building, and particularly where the person would step out into the open. It was inside, almost inside a little niche on the ground floor. So they had and the secrecy and the research continued beyond. Now, the Norden bomb site was instrumental in destroying the German industrial energies, particularly the ball bearing industry. Now, I had never thought about it, but almost everything in the military rolls on ball bearings. And if you destroy the ball bearings, you almost destroy the military. And the only thing that was left for the Germans to use at the end of the war was the large Big Bertha, a cannon that was larger than the ones that were on the great battleships we had. The battleships could fire a missile or a detonating bomb over 10 miles. And this particular Big Bertha was carried on a railroad, and railroads don't go on ball bearings. They go on a journal. And that, I'm not going to try to explain that, but anyway, that was the only weapon they had in addition to the buzz bombs. But the buzz bombs were not accurate, while the Norden bomb site could almost put a bomb down a smokestack if it wanted to in industry. And by the way, as an aside, when the war started, the Second World War started, Florida became an airport. Almost every small town in the state had an airport. And if anyone's familiar with the movie 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, where the Norden bomb site was used to destroy the ball-bearing industry, the training for that particular secret mission took place in Williston. And they trained pilots to take a B-25, which was a small attack bomber, off an aircraft carrier on the Williston Airport. That was an interesting aside. Now, when the war came, after the war, a change took place, and I want to make a distinction. We had a state of Florida pass a law which was known as the Florida Institute of Continuing University Law, or nicknamed ficus. Now, ficus is distinctive from IFAS, but it does describe the two most important functions of the land-grant university, the continuing education and the ag extension. And ficus became the division of continuing, it took over the division of continuing education. And that problem existed because the institute known as ficus, the president that was appointed was a squadron commander of our elected governor. And he appointed the gentleman as president, and he thought he was the president of every institution in the state. So he dismantled continuing education at the University of Florida, and there was several divisions. One was extension education, or extension classrooms, and the director of the extension classroom in Jacksonville became the director of continuing education here at the University of Florida. Only by that time, as I said, it's changed its name. And one other item that the Seagle Building did after that time, we had some periods of time, particularly around the time when the student was killed in Kent State, where the riots in the United States were related to, they related to Gainesville because a riot was planned at one particular time, and people don't realize it, but the Seagle Building was a post where the Secret Service had sharpshooters, and they could cover the whole area of the the city of Gainesville. And their activity didn't need to be taken because what happened was that riot that had been planned was to take place during Dead Week. Now, if you don't understand Dead Week, that reminds me of another thing that I was going to mention about the Seagle Building. It was a part of the first two classes at the university. The first two classes at the university at the time were known as a college, first 2 years were known as University College, and the students in university colleges were graded by a machine that was located in the Seagle Building. In fact, it got the nickname, it was called by some of those students as the Flunkenstein Building. And that was another interesting thing that happened. Now, ficus became the president of ficus thought he was the president, and he walked into the university and tried to take over all of the university's activity, and the university didn't like it, and he had the same result. He took over the Coast Guard Training Center in St. Petersburg and located that as his home base. He dismantled some of the things that were happening in the Seagle Building. For instance, he took the children's library to St. Petersburg, and wherever it still exists is unknown. It may have completely disappeared when ficus was removed from existence. This unhappiness that resulted from the attempt of administering all state universities by one person brought about his dismissal and the changing of the ficus into a non-entity. And so the Division of Continuing Education became the building or the activity that I was interviewed for, and I was put in a position in conferences and institutes. Now, to tell you what conferences and institutes are, they were developed similar along the line by an activity that took place generally in the late 1800s, and they were named Chautauquas. Chautauquas were week-long activities in most instances, and they covered some educational aspect, but they also covered housing and other activities that people would be involved in, and took them on various excursions. Now, that later became a part of the continuing education responsibility. We had Camp Roosevelt was located near Bellevue. However, they moved many of their activities to the University of Florida. And out of that, Dr. Black helping the chemist, the wastewater people became involved. And one of the responsibilities that I had with continuing education at the university was the development of a program, well, no, not the taking over or taking the responsibility for the program known as the Water and Wastewater Operators Association. It was a long week, full week activity that took place once every year. And generally in the end of March, at that time, we were on the quarter system, and there was a quarter break of a full week. And that gave me an opportunity to bring a group on campus and put them in classrooms on campus. We had somewhere between 350 to 400 people for a week when I became responsible for that particular program. And that particular program had an activity known as a barbecue, and they had a barbecue at Boulware Springs, and that was on the first night after opening. And then they had an award ceremony, and then a general business banquet. Those were 3 functions that I had responsibility to organize, and I had some wonderful experiences with those people and learned a lot of new things. Now, in my background as a student at the university, one of the things that became important was the idea of a power structure. And so that led me into understanding a little bit about, well, in fact, quite a bit about politics. When we had I was involved in the development of the curriculum for the annual short school, as we called it. And during one of those particular development stages, the group that came to help me understand who they wanted on the programs and what subject. Well, the subject matters were pretty important, and they were technical and needed to be developed well. So it took a while sometimes to explain and get me ready to create the activity for the group. At the time, the university had made a direct effort to get rid of the Seagle Building. And I had a group of people in the training program to develop the upcoming short school. And after the short school was over, or the planning session became over, I started dreaming, and the Seagle Building became my model for a dream, because I thought better than to just throw the building away or do away with it was to remodel it and build an academy. Now, the word academy relates to some educational experience. And my idea was to have a full-time staff on the university faculty in the Seagle Building to provide contact with the large group of people throughout the state that had responsibility for water and wastewater operations. And as we were ready to leave that conference, one of the gentlemen that was there said, well, that's a good idea, and I'm sorry, it will never happen. I said, well, maybe what are you saying it won't happen? He said, well, who's going to head it up and what's going to happen? So I said, well, I have to ask you a question. Do you know, now this was a gentleman from Fort Lauderdale. I said, do you know the gentleman who is on the Board of Regents from your community? He said, oh yes, know him well. I said, well, why don't you have a discussion with him and tell him of our idea? And he said, I'll do that. Anyway, there were some very significant, the head of the water department in Jacksonville was also in the group, and I asked him the same question. And the gentleman from Pensacola that was, he headed the utility department of Pensacola, and I asked him, and in fact, before we left that planning session, there were 4 of the 5 Board of Regents members who had friends who were going to explain to them what we had dreamed up for the Seagle Building. Well, when I left, no one in the university was involved because it was a one-time planning session, and I didn't expect anything to happen except about 6 weeks later, my boss at the time, who headed up conferences and institutes, came into my office and he said, Richard, the vice president just called. He wants me to come down and talk to him about sewage and wastewater engineers. And I said, well, what gave him such an idea? Anyway, we went to he took me with him, and the vice president, Bob, I'll get it in a minute. The vice president asked my boss a question, and he turned the answer over to me. He asked him a second question, and the answer was turned over to me. The third question, Bob Bryan, vice president, asked me the third question directly. So you could feel the shift in emphasis and who then had the control. Well, the answer to turning the Seagle Building into a training academy was we could not do it until we have an engineer study of the Seagle Building. And of course, the engineer that came was hired by the university. And it seemed to me that, as it turns out, they wanted so badly to get rid of the Seagle Building that they knew what engineer was going to come up with. And the engineer told them that the building itself was not stable enough to hold the load that would be involved in training people. So he said, we will just not, well, after the first meeting with Dr. Bryan, I was called directly and asked to come see him. And so I went without my particular division director or department chairman. And Dr. Bryan explained how the Seagle Building was not capable of taking the load. And I came up with a statement, well, Dr. Bryan, someone is going to build it. Now, I assume from his response that he must have thought the Board of Regents wanted it, so maybe it's a good idea. So he said, well, do you think you can get the money for it? I said, well, I have to have the opportunity given to me by you. He said, well, if you can get a law, have the state give us the money to build it, we will build a center for training. And so when I went back home, I began thinking about what really I needed to do. And the first thing that I needed to do was to get into the realm of what to do with politics. And I had had an occasion in the past to deal with my state farm agent, who at the time was Ralph Turlington. And Ralph Turlington was also a state representative who had been in the House for probably as long as any other representative in the state. And Ralph asked me, he asked me some questions, and I thought he was so negative to me that he was not being favorable at all. And we had a 15-minute appointment, and it stretched out to about 35, 40 minutes. And finally, he said, yeah, well, this is a good idea. Let's go with it. And I couldn't understand it, so I said, well, now you asked me some of the darndest questions that I have ever had, and I thought you were just absolutely going to run me out of the place. He said, well, if I am favorable, he says, people are going to ask me questions, and I've got to know the answers, and so you've given me my material. He says, now here's what we're going to do. He says, first of all, don't introduce it as a building that's going to be for the University of Florida. Introduce it by someone outside of the community. Well, at that point, I didn't know who I was going to get, but I said, okay. He said, now, first of all, we have to have all of our people. And he listed Senator Saunders, who was in the Senate, and in fact, I think was the Senate-elect. No, not at that time, but he was later when I became active with him. He was a president-elect in the Senate. But he said, we talked to all of the local people. He said, and you need to bring in our senator from Ocala, which at the time was Jim Williams. And in fact, he did get involved. And the representative from Ocala also got involved. And we had all of the representatives. Anyway, we had all of the representatives and the senator from the state in a meeting, and Ralph didn't show up. And I had to carry it on without his support. And every one of them was favorable and were favorably impressed. And so I went back to Ralph. I said, why didn't you come? He said, I didn't want them to think they were having to respond to me. He said, they needed to respond to you. So he gave me the best advice all along and was the most useful in the best way he could be. And later on, when we had a meeting with Ralph and Jim Williams, and I provided Ralph Turlington and Jim parking permits on the campus at the time. And I handed this parking permit. We were going to meet in a prior meeting. Our meeting was to take place before a meeting that they were also scheduling at the Shands Hospital. And so I got them private permit parking for them. And Ralph looked at that. He said, what's this? I said, well, it's a parking permit. He says, you know, he said, the university has called on me for several occasions, and I have probably contributed at least $2,000 over the years on parking fines, and no one has ever taken care of my parking for me. So I think I made a pretty good impression. And that meeting did develop into great support. And as time went on, I had a call from outside, and the individual that follows out of my previous interview, which was only taped and not videoed, called me up one day and he says, I've just been elected to the state representative, as a state representative. He said, and Ralph Turlington has just been made the Speaker of the House. Do you think you know him well enough that you can ask him for me to help me get a position on the school board, the chair of, a seat in the Committee on Education? Well, I didn't realize at the time, but I do now know that education takes up probably at least, if not more, than half of the entire state budget. So getting a freshman representative on the seat would not be an easy task. And of course, I did go to talk to Ralph Turlington and explain to him my mission. And one of the questions he asked me was, why does he want a position on the school board, on the school committee? Education, okay. Well, I explained to him that John Riles, who was a gentleman who had asked me, was employed by the firm that rented caps and gowns and published annuals for many of the schools throughout the state. And that he felt like he would be able to help some of the principals that he knew well throughout the state. And that was why he wanted the position. Well, it turns out, Ralph says, John called me and asked me if I had talked to Ralph, and I told him yes. And I told him what I had told him about his need or want. And he said, now, Richard, you didn't really tell him all that. And I did. And he got his job. He got a seat on the education committee, which, as I pointed out, was almost impossible to expect. So he later thanked me. And one of the things that he thanked me for is that when I got into the effort to introduce the bill, I called John up and asked him if he would introduce the bill for me. And John agreed to it very quickly. And about 2 weeks later, he called me up and said, Richard, I've read your bill. He says, and I don't have an idea of what you're talking about. He said, would you mind if I got Guy Spicola to introduce the bill? Well, I didn't know who Guy Spicola was, but whatever his decision was, it was all right with me. Turns out that Guy Spicola was the chairman of the Environmental Protection Committee in the state legislature. And he didn't introduce it as his bill, he introduced it as the committee's bill. So we already had 22 votes in the final passage of the bill. And I was very thankful and happy for that. Then it came time to get I back up a bit. Ralph one day said, okay, Richard, it's time to write the bill. I said, what do you mean write a bill? I don't have any idea. He said, well, I'll tell you, he said, what I really want you to do is to write your story as to what you want. And fortunately, my first year as a graduate student was as the director of the school facilities lab. So I had some idea of the architectural demands for a building, and particularly one that was going to be in the field of education. So I wrote a bill to design a facility and put the name TREEO, Training, Research, and Education for Environmental Occupations. And Guy Spicola introduced it into the House, and the same bill was introduced by Senator Williams in the Senate. It was a companion bill, and I don't recall the numbers, but they were House numbers, and Senate numbers were different bills, but they were identical, word for word, which means that in passage it's a lot simpler because it has to pass by both houses of both the House and the Senate, and then a committee to rationalize any changes that have to be made so that it's a single bill, and then goes back through the voting process. But if it's the same bill, identical, there's no middle process that it has to go through. Now, when the came time to get the bill introduced into the House, it was introduced by Guy Spicola, and I later asked Jim Williams, and he introduced it. And we went along. I'm now going to get into the effort to pass a bill. This is a well drawn out process of politics, and it had some ups and downs and places, and I'm going to explain how I went about what happened. We had people from all over the state that were interested in the TREEO Center, and I first of all was able to use some of this federal money and hired 2 individuals from university students who were on college work study program, and I could use them for 15 hours. One of them was a law student with his law degree, and it's a strange situation in the law school. He already had his Juris Doctorate, but he had to go back to law school to get a master's degree in a specialty, and he was specializing in business law, and he became one of my students who helped me in the development of my research program. I mean, my activity of politicking and getting the support for the program. It took about 2.5 years of activity before we ever got to the legislature that allowed us to have in our field people informed as to what was being done at the legislative level and who was involved and how it was processed. First of all, when the bill was introduced, it was set to go to the House Environmental Protection Committee, which it had already passed because that was the committee that introduced it. It was also go to the Finance Committee and then to the Education Committee. What happened was that we struggled, and after it was introduced, it took a while. I had to lobby, not lobby. I introduced myself to the legislative process by registering as a lobbyist for the University of Florida. And the reason I registered was I walked into one of the senators, and he says, "Are you registered?" I said, "No." He said, "What's registered?" He said, "Well, I'm going to take you to jail right now." And he was teasing, of course. He says, "You have to be a registered lobbyist before you can speak to any legislator." So I went directly and registered before I spoke to anyone else further. Now, on the day that it was to be heard, it was at the end of the year. We spent several weeks talking, and in fact, I sat down and told almost every senator and representative our story as to what was being done and why it was significant and what it would do for the university and for the people of Florida. So I had a lot of information that was passed out, but I still didn't know what the vote was going to be. And it came to the point where we were reaching at the end of the session, and the legislature has a deadline. If you're not in in the process or finished at least 2 weeks in advance, you don't have a chance. Well, on about 3 weeks in advance, I had a promise from my senator that he would introduce the bill and get it in the Senate the next day. And I went in and watched that program, watched from the galley, and the time went by and the bill was never introduced. So I went to him and said, well, why isn't it introduced? Why didn't you do what you told me to do? He said, the Rules Committee told me I couldn't do it, even though he was Senate President-elect. He said, told me I couldn't do it. He said, there wasn't anything in the House, and there wasn't any time, we didn't have time to waste on putting it into the Senate, because if it wasn't in the House and already passed through the House, then we didn't have any need for it to be in the Senate. So I said, well, my goodness. Anyway, I went home, back to the House side, and where I had generally had my office. I had been given one of the state representative from Florida, from Gainesville. He gave me freedom to use his office for anything I needed. And I went back, and a friend of mine who had come with me, actually he was one of the representatives of the Operators Association. He was former president of the association. He was there, and I was downtrodden because it was not going to happen. And I said, let's go back to the hotel. I've got to pack up and go home. He said, well, it's going to be heard tonight in the House Finance Committee. I said, how in the world did that happen? Well, I found out later. That morning, when I walked in, I got on the elevator, on the ground floor. It stopped at the first floor, and a friend of mine from Plant City, who was and fortunately, he was on the House Finance Committee. I told him all the things that day was going to happen over in the Senate, and we were moving over there, so we have to move here in the House. And he was just a friend, close friend, and that was all that happened on the elevator, one floor. So I spent the day and came back to not his office, but the representative from Gainesville. And I was informed that it was on the House Refinance Committee. Turns out that I went into that meeting that evening, and the representative from Guy Spicola was not there. Now, it turns out when you have your bill in a committee, the representative or the introducer of it has to be there to hear the bill, to represent it. And Guy wasn't in there. And I waited, and it turns out that when the bill for the TREEO Center came into the Finance Committee meeting, they asked, where's the introducer, where's the representative that introduced it? He's not here. So they said, well, we'll pass the bill. And lay it aside. It didn't pass. In other words, they put it aside. And I sent back the aide to Guy Spicola's office, and he came back not with Guy, but with Guy's aide. And when everything was passed and the meeting was about to be over, except for the one bill that came back, the aide said it was a good bill. That was all he said. And it passed the House Finance Committee. The finance chairman had gone to Miami because his wife had called him, and she was ill, and he had left town. The chairman of that committee meeting was a young man from Plant City that had been on the elevator that I told all the good things that did not ever happen. And he in his handwriting there were 25 bills already in the agenda for the Finance Committee, and they passed 26 bills, and the 26th bill in his handwriting was put in by him that morning when he went into the committee meeting. So it was one of those things that happened that just happened. You never know. Anyway, then we got to the point where later on I mentioned that the bill, let's see, the House Senate bill. After the bill passed the Finance Committee, it got scheduled for the Education. And it turns out that the chairman of the Education Committee was from Palatka. And there's a new city owned by AT&T. The chairman of their wastewater treatment plant knew he was a backdoor neighbor to the chairman of the Education Committee. And they had they had charcoal broiled steaks in the neighbor backyard that night before the committee meeting. So the House Education Committee passed it. And then there was the another one, Rules Committee. And the Rules Committee was chaired by my friend John. And John, it passed the House and was completely through and ready to go, and nothing was happening in the Senate. And after that day, I was so unhappy. Anyway, we got there, and I'm sitting up there looking and watching and thinking, I'm dead. I can't get anything. And an idea came into my head, and why the idea came, I'll never know. The 9th grade civics teacher that I had always said, every citizen has a right to petition his government for the redress of a wrong. And that idea kept going over and over in my head. And what happened was that I walked out of the Senate, went back over to the House, sat down at the typewriter, and typed out a minimum petition. And the petition said, this will be circulated between every member of the Senate. This bill has passed in the House and is on the agenda for the Senate, but it has not been moved because of an objection. And I'm petitioning the redress of a wrong. And I put it in, the first person on the list was Senator Williams. And I got an opportunity to see Senator Williams during that session. And I showed him the petition, and it had each senator in a place. But his name was going to have to be first. And he looked at it, and he thought and thought and thought. He says, well, Richard, he said, I'm going to tell you. He says, tomorrow we have a consent agenda. I don't know if you know what a consent agenda is, but here's what happens. A bill is read for its third reading, and it is passed without any discussion, and it is passed unanimously, because if there is a single question which would cause a discussion, the bill will fail. It's a consent agenda. In other words, every bill on the agenda has already theoretically been passed. He said, it's not on the agenda yet, but let me talk to the Rules Committee chairman, and I'll tell you later. So I went up in the galley and I watched, and he sat down, and the process, I don't remember what the process was, but I noticed that Senator Williams sat down and didn't pay any attention to anything. He was paying attention to what was going on. Then all of a sudden he got up and he walked over to the Rules Committee chairman and then wandered up in back of the state Senate president, and was looking at the wall over his head. And pretty soon the Rules Committee chairman came up there and they had a conversation in the back of the Senate president while business was going on. Then Senator Williams went back to his seat and sat down. The Rules Committee chairman came back and sat down, and process went on. In a little while, I was up in the gallery watching the process and didn't know what in the world was happening. But anyway, I looked up, and Senator Williams looked up at me and motioned for me to meet him. And they will go outside and talk to you. And he went out. There's a side door and a main entrance. The main entrance is usually the one that people go into. But lobbyists who send notes in to the senator get to them out in a vestibule on the side of the Senate. And he came out. He said, we're going to arrange to put it on the agenda for the consent. He said, tomorrow. And that really was interesting. Now, when they opened the Senate session for that particular session, I was in the galley watching. And the Senate president looked at the senator. He says, what does the senator from this, and he called the district number, rise for? And he says, got up, and Senator Williams said, as chairman of the committee, I'm going to take the bill from this House, bill number so-and-so and so-and-so, and put it in place of the Senate bill. In other words, he took the House bill and added it as a bill for the Senate, the same bill that hadn't passed, was in together. And the Senate president looked at everybody. He said, now, I didn't know he was going to do that, folks. He says, don't anybody else try such a thing. So you know, it's an education to watch things like that happen. Anyway, when this consent agenda came up, they called the bill number, and it passed unanimously. In fact, it passed unanimously in the House, and it passed unanimously. Not a single vote was cast against it. I had lobbied in a year and a half. I spent traveling around the state with a model of the wastewater treatment plant and an educational institution, and carried it into all the meetings of the operator associations and their district meetings on a big 8x10 or 8x4, 4x8 plywood. We had the model there so they could look at an educational facility in the environment of a wastewater treatment plant. And that was one of the things that I had also used my money for. I allowed, in the College of Architecture, they do not have a doctoral program. They have the Master of Arts, and their Master of Arts requires a thesis. And I engaged a young man who was on, he took on as a thesis for his master's degree in architecture the idea of the TREEO Center. And so that's where the model was built. And we used it and carried it all over the state as an example of what we were going to introduce into the House and Senate, and the bill that was to create the TREEO Center. And now I've already explained how it was created. There were still other things. Once the bill passed, it had to go to the governor. The governor signed it, and the governor I got a good handshake when it was done with the governor's picture. And then nothing happened for a while. And it turns out that I had to make an appointment with the chancellor of the university system. And when I told him that this TREEO Center bill had passed, he looked at me, he said, well, good. He said, I got several new universities, and one of them might get an award of a good prize. He says, so anyone who wants the TREEO Center can have it if they will tell me why. So I then had another politicking to do, and this one was more difficult. And I'll tell you, it's quite a bit more difficult to politic the Board of Regents than it is to politic legislature. The legislators are elected, and they listen, whether they agree with you or don't. They never let you know what their vote is going to be. But they listen to any and everyone who wants an opportunity to talk. But you can't get to some of those regions. They're isolated. But apparently I had some close enough people that they could get to them. So I had when the bill came up, or when the chancellor of the system had a meeting in Tallahassee to appoint the community or the school that was going to have the TREEO Center. They had Florida International, Florida Tech in Ocala, in Orlando, University of South Florida, and the University of Florida. There were 4 different schools that had bids for it. And one of the things that happened was that I made an assessment. I put each of those schools on a column, and below that column gave the things that they should have, the reason they should have the TREEO Center. And I sent it to all the city managers in the state and all the whatever else, other people that I could send it to. I had 4 columns. Of course, the column under the University of Florida had a longer column and more interest than any other. But the University of South Florida had a pretty significant one. And the University of South Florida, Guy Spicola, had been invited by the University of South Florida to come to Tallahassee with him on an airplane on the day that they were going to have the meeting that designated. And unknown to me, in a later conversation with Guy said, he said the dean of the Department of Engineering from South Florida had made arrangements with me to fly up to Tallahassee and talk about the TREEO Center being located at the University of South Florida. He said, on Sunday, before the meeting on Thursday, I was reading my paper, and I'm enrolled or engaged in a competition for the state senate. He says, and what happens but do I read a contribution in money by the dean of the College of Engineering at South Florida to my opponent. So on Thursday, he called me up one morning. In the early morning, he said, well, we've arranged for the aircraft. He said, I can pick you up and take you out to the airport, and we could fly up to Tallahassee and come home. And he said, I said to him, I'm not fixing to get on an airplane and fly anywhere with you now or ever. And hung up. Now, I know that happened after, and I would imagine that they would have been more competition for the TREEO Center than any of the other. There was competition for Florida Tech in Orlando, but the Kennedy Senate was phasing out, and Florida Tech lost much of its emphasis. The University of South Florida Engineering could have used the TREEO Center to an advantage, because the city of Tampa was very active, and they had had several bad situations where they had to have engineering help. And so they were the only real competition I had. And the fact that Guy Spicola didn't show up probably tilted what I thought I thought I already had 4 of the 5. I did not ever approach our local representative on the chancellor system, because he was, again, using Turlington's idea, his being local was probably not the best person to support. Well, I wanted his support, but it wasn't the best person to try to be lobbying for it. It had to be the other 4. So it turns out that they appointed, on the day that they made the appointment, they appointed the TREEO Center to the University of Florida. And from that point on, we had to do some thinking and a lot of work. It got to the point where it was time to start the building. We had a conference with all the people that were going to be involved. We had, I'm going to have to back off just a moment. The time came to bid for the contract to build the building. And I have forgotten to mention, and I didn't, it's a significant thing that I have to include. During the time that we were involved in working on this, the federal government had already passed the bill at the federal level creating the the Environmental Protection Agency. But the Environmental Protection Agency was only an administrator of other programs, and they had then to pass bills for each of the environmental concerns. There is a wastewater or pollution control bill. There's an air pollution control bill. There's a solid waste management control bill. There's a number of, and I think sound, but each of those bills are separate bills giving EPA the right to administer those programs. In the pollution control bill, there is a section known as the 109B Center, 109B section. The 109B section designated $250,000 for a training program for each of the 50 independent states. And I had written a grant proposal for the $250,000 for the University of Florida, for the TREEO Center. And when we were opening bids, or about to open bids on Tuesday, someone in the activity asked me, well, where do we get, see, I had, that particular grant had gone through all sorts of political processes. They had been approved and signed by the governor and sent to the engineer in the EPA in Atlanta for approval. They had the final approval, and I think it was about 8 months later it had sat there and nothing had been done with it. And about the day we were opening bids or talking about bids procedures. And someone said to me, how do we gain access to that federal money that you're talking about? And I said, oh, well, it's controlled by the EPA in Atlanta. And so they called Atlanta, and the man in Atlanta sat there and he said, you can't take bids until I've approved it. He said, it's not approved, you can't get any money until it is approved, and if you accept a bid, we'll never approve it for it, because it negates our being in there first. So I went to Atlanta on a trip on Sunday evening, and on Monday morning, I walked across the overpass that walked over the interstate. I slept in a hotel across from EPA and walked over the overpass and ran into, of all people, a newly elected federal national government representative from Port St. Joe. And I told him what I was there for, and he says, well, if you need any help, let me know. And I walked into the engineer's office in the district office of EPA, and he told me in no uncertain terms that if I accepted bids, there was no way the grant money was going to get given. And I left there. I said, well, I've just talked to Representative so-and-so, and he told me if I needed any help to let him know. I said, now here's what I'm going to do. That bill, that grant proposal, 109B Center, has sat for 8 months on your desk and has gotten no attention. And I happen to know that the people in Washington, D.C. are concerned that not a single 109B grant has been issued. And they're going to know that this one has sat on your desk for 8 months without approval. And I walked out of his office. When I got back to Gainesville, found out the money was already in the bag for the 109B Center. So those things have been interesting and stories part of the history that I think is significant. Now, one of the things that I forgot to mention, I did mention the Norton bomb site and the proximity fuse. Okay, that was covered. Well, now was the process of getting the building built. And now we went to a meeting, and everyone that was there, we had granted the Clements Rumpel, got the bid out of Jacksonville. They were the architects for the upcoming TREEO Center, which was not going to be the Seagle Building, because the Seagle Building wasn't strong enough, even though it's been there and is still there and has withstood all sorts of things. Like, for instance, I sat in my office one day and watched a tornado go by and tear up the Combs Lumber Company, eight blocks north of us. It came off the Paynes Prairie. It came right by, and you could hear the whistles of all the windows and the winds blowing through the windows in the Seagle Building at the time. We also had a new building built across the street on 4th Street, the telephone office, and when they were tamping the ground in the foundation, the Seagle Building shook, but it's still standing, and it's still there, and it's still a big part of the life of the university, whether people knew about it or not. And the beginning of the year, that's when I developed the model, and I started traveling throughout the state. And one of the things that happened as I walked out of the room that we had where we had the meeting. Now we had the architects and the builders who had bid on the building and gotten the bid, and the engineer from the water department, the engineer from the wastewater treatment. Anyway, we had quite a few people. At the end of that particular conference session, the water engineer walked up to me and says, "Richard, I did not know that the University of Florida had ever had such a program as the short school." He says, "Would they be interested in doing a program for water field distribution?" Now, I came up with an idea. I said, "Well, I'll tell you what. Yes and no." I said, "First of all, I have to know, the university has given me a credit card. They didn't actually give me a credit card, but they've given me the authority to spend money if I can expect to engage in advertising and get money for our services." In other words, it's like a private business. I can spend money in advance if I can guarantee that I'll make money off the program that we develop. Now, I took a risk, and I told him, "Yes, I have a credit card, and I think if you'd help me, because I know very little about field distribution, never been involved in a program, that we will be able to do such a program." I said, "You'll have to tell me what information you want on the program and tell me who are some of the speakers that I can get and how many people we might expect, and then we'll decide whether we can get enough money out of the program or not." "Yes, let's do it." Well, it turns out that I had in that particular activity a program with a person that I had never heard of as a speaker. He had been a speaker that my engineering friend had heard at an AWWA meeting a couple of years earlier on the idea of contamination through backflow prevention, or through backflow, and particularly of a substance known as chlordane. Now, chlordane used to be, you could walk down to the hardware store and buy a gallon of it and make all the pesticide treatment for termites that you could imagine. But it was so tremendously superior to anything else. It had a half-life of about 500 years. And when you treated foundations with pesticide, you also had the possibility of killing half of the people that were involved, because chlordane was still going to be there when that building had fallen down, and no one would know it was there. So they finally eventually disallowed its being able to be manufactured. But here's what happened. The speaker told his story, and his story was about an infection through backflow of a city water section, which was 8 blocks in size. The superintendent of the water utility was walking down the hall one day, and he heard his telephone operator, his receptionist, answer the phone. He said, "Yes." He says, "That happens quite often. And what you need to do is just let your water run a while, and it'll finally clear up, and everything will be all right." And the superintendent walked in, and he said, "Son," he said, "what did that man ask you?" He said, "He told me that he had just had a backflow of about 50 gallons of chlordane into a water system." And the superintendent said, "Did you get his phone number?" He said, "Call him up this minute and tell him to shut the water down and don't let anybody in the whole daggum section touch any water in their pipes. He says, that is the most severe, dangerous substance we could ever have in our water system. What had happened was a gentleman got up one day. Now, the utility, I got this gentleman for almost free for a speaker because I needed to be sure I had a budget that I could make the money enough to pay for the bills. And I got him for only his travel expense. He came as a representative of his company, and he represented American Utilities, American Cities Water Supply. And American Cities is a private enterprise that has large city water systems all over the United States. And the particular one that we're talking about was Chattanooga, Tennessee. And the superintendent had heard this gentleman, and he stopped him. He says, call up the man, don't let him touch it. Now what turns out was that this water supply had been contaminated with chlordane. And the speaker that we got was the person who had told the gentleman not to let anybody use the water. And he told his story. And his story was very interesting, and it fit in quite well. And it was, here's a repeat as quickly as I can do it. Chlordane attaches itself to the interior of what was used at the time. We used to have what was called galvanized pipe was used. Piping, most of the piping we use in America today is plastic. But in that day, they had galvanized piping. Now, galvanized piping had a problem. Water, unknown or being unaware, water is a universal solvent. It will dissolve lead. And just out of history, we know that the Roman Empire used an aqueduct to bring their water into Rome. And they put lead in the interior of the aqueduct. And it has been estimated that the lead in the water caused the reduction of intelligence of the Roman Empire, of all the people in the Roman Empire, and ultimately its fall. So lead in our piping system was a problem if you get pesticides in the system. And chlordane had a habit of not being flushed. It reached up and grabbed a little handle of the substance, not in lead. The operators of water system found out that they had to put calcium carbonate in their water to cause a coating inside the lead pipe to prevent the water from eating lead out of the galvanized pipe. Now, that calcium carbonate, as an example, in Hillsborough County, Tampa has its hospital on an island called Davis Island. Davis Island was dredged up out of the ocean, or out of the bay, and the soil is heavily contaminated with all sorts of things. And the piping system in the Tampa and on Davis Island had been coated itself with the calcium carbonate to the point that a 3-inch pipe was now had about an inch of left for the calcium had built up. They had to go in and scrape that out. And now, the reason calcium was used and the reason it was important in the Chattanooga system was chlordane had a habit of reaching up and hanging on like a strap in a subway. The hanging on to the hanger, some of the chlordane would hang on to that calcium. And over time, as the flow increased and everything, some of that chlordane would drop. And over time, the drinking of the water with that chlordane in it would cause kidney problems. And no one ever knew that they were dying from chlordane poisoning. They were dying from kidney problems. In fact, a later incident with backflow, the judge said that the water department had no responsibility, only the water department had killed several people. So when they stopped the water supply from going, they had to provide, they built spigots in the city. They built a place where each person in the 8 city block area, they had three alternatives. One was to steam clean the entire system. But to steam clean, the pressure would tear up every valve in the system. So that was not an alternative. And the other was to ream it out like they reamed it out, and that was too expensive. Anyway, or replace it. So in that particular instance, they decided that they had to replace 8 city blocks of water system. And only one house in the whole 8 city blocks did not have a contamination of chlordane in it, but they replaced that house also. It cost the utility well over, in 1963 or 64, well over $750,000 to clean that particular contamination up. Today it would be in the several millions of dollars. And in fact, another incident similar to that happened well, let me get back to that a minute. The chlordane contamination. They cleaned it out, and at the end of the 8 weeks it took to get everything filled and replaced. And in the 8 weeks, they had run pipes into the community so that at the spigot, but they had someone there opening and closing that spigot and locking it for overnight. They didn't want any contamination in that particular point. And then at the end, they had a guest speaker to come in and thank everybody for their cooperation. And it was, they took during those 8 weeks, once a week, they took a busload of people out to a KOA or a similar resort area where they could do their laundry and do other things, so that all that expense had to be done, because if you left that chlordane in the system, it wouldn't hurt for a while, but pretty soon people would and they wouldn't know what did the problem. Let me get to the house. Okay, we passed the Seagle, the appointment on the day. I didn't know of Guy Spicola's refusal to travel until after that was over, but it was probably turned the point, and the IFAS was no longer a part. It was a board of regents, and they appointed University of Florida to build it, and now I'm looking at a program being run while the building was being built. So it took a couple of years, or three years probably, and in the meantime, this water distribution building. I did seminars. I didn't do them on the water distribution. In that distribution, this backflow program came to mind, and I began a series of cross-connection control and backflow prevention management seminars all over the state of Florida, and those were done while the building was being built. And nothing was ever done with how, and as we began this series of programs, I realized there's a significant mechanical device involved in backflow prevention. Now, there are several devices that can be used for the different types of backflow. Backflow of water occurs almost every day in every system from the difference in pressure. The atmospheric pressure will cause water to go up to some height, probably 34 feet high. I think there's 16 or 17 point of pressure that will push water up a hill. And that's called back siphonage. If you have a device that will stop that from happening. And then there is a device that you have a back pressure, and we have several devices. Double check valves are the first effort was used to stop the backflow. Now, where backflow became significant was during prior to the World War II, the Japanese were building up their supply of metal. Japan locally has no metal. They were shipping shiploads of scrap metal from the United States for a number of years during the Depression. And when those ships would dock, they would bring in diseases from the Orient. And the diseases would show up several miles from the port, and the epidemiologist called in and says, well, the only way that this could happen is through water distribution, because air won't travel that far. And so they said, well, we'll put a flapper valve in, and it'll stop that, no problem. They put 3 flapper valves in, it still didn't stop the problem. So they finally came up with a device called a double check valve, which had a reasonable description of having 2 check valves with a resilient seal and a positive seat and spring-loaded to create at least a 1-pound pressure differential across the valve. And they found out that that didn't completely do it all, because once in a while that device would wear out or eat up or something would happen and it wouldn't stop it. So they came up with what they call a reduced pressure zone backflow preventer. And I'm not going to attempt to explain how it works because it's a little more complicated. It took me almost a year to get down to where I could really talk about what it does and how it does it. But anyway, we do now have a reduced pressure zone backflow preventer, which prevents both back siphonage and back pressure backflow. But you need to get it in place, and it has to be tested. So all of these things have come into play as we built the TREEO Center, and as I was doing all this information, I began building a whole new area of concern. The TREEO Center was really, the idea started out with just one program, and that was the water and wastewater workshop. And when I retired in 1984, the center had over 44 different programs in the environment that I was involved in helping get established. So I feel like I've made a contribution to history and to the people of Florida particularly, and to people of almost the entire nation. So I'm a little bit proud, I guess, of my contribution, or this is what I call my legacy. And that's why I think it's a significant story to tell. And the story of the TREEO Center, we're about to venture out and venture into. And now, the TREEO Center is about, I've already entered into the passage of the law that created the center, but what does it do? The TREEO Center has environmental protection activities in every field of the environment, and it also started out with the idea of being a local environmental center, and anytime anybody anywhere wanted to know how to treat water or wastewater, they could come to us, and we would design, and it's still in effect, we would design a program that could be packaged and either carried to them, or they could come to the university campus and support, and it would be taught. And that is where the word research fit in. It did not intend ever to do basic research at the TREEO Center, but we have had, and I'm going to give you one example. There are others, but I don't think I need to spend more time than just this one, on process and problem-solving research. The city of Waldo could not meet the federal requirement for the BOD removal of water, of sewage from its sewer water, and the University of Florida TREEO Center staff member spent about 6 months helping them design a solution. The design of the solution was to design a berm outside of the sewer plant, and when the effluent was dumped, it was dumped into the berm and would flow through a growth of vegetation and other plants. And on the outside where the outflow occurred, they had, by that time, met the requirement. So it was a research, problem-solving research, and a solution to a wastewater environmental contamination. Actually, the same thing has occurred on the university campus. They replaced the old wastewater plant, which was on the corner down on the corner from the Wrights Union, and the plant used a sheet flow. Well, actually, the 16th Street wastewater treatment plant for the city of Gainesville has a sheet flow, but to meet their requirements of water through Sweetwater Creek. And Sweetwater Creek spreads out the wastewater that they dump, which doesn't quite meet their requirement, and it flows across a sheet widespread plane into a sinkhole in the Paynes Prairie. And when it gets to the sinkhole, it's met its requirement. So the ideas that were developed have been significant and are a part of environmental concerns for the state of Florida, for the people of Florida, and for the nation. The activity of the cross connections control and backflow prevention was one of the major first activities that took place in the building itself. Our first activity was the wastewater seminar workshop. Now, I need to talk about just a bit about that one workshop, because it had some fun things happen. We had a gentleman that parked his truck in the vice president's parking lot. And I'm on the campus roaming around and keeping things running, not having any real problems, but it was just one of the things you wanted to do, to be sure that things stayed on an even keel. And a police officer, one of the school campus police officers came up. He says, "We've got somebody." And he said, the vice president said, "By lunchtime, when I come back from lunch," he said, "that car or vehicle better be moved." And of course, he says, we don't want to move it. It's got a county license plate on it. And I don't want to cause a problem with the county. Anyway, so I got the gentleman to move his car. And we didn't have a problem. The vice president got his parking place. The vice president also was responsible for utility operations for the university. So he got a little bit disturbed. Now that was one thing, and then there was the other. There was another thing, and the day we had the day before we had our first meeting we had a torrential downpour, and the Vice President Bryant was the speaker at the first meeting, and he welcomed everyone. He says, "We got a good dose of good water for you yesterday, didn't we?" Anyway, so there were things that happened during the program that were of interest, and we had a good working relationship with that group. They have later left campus because of another incident that happened, and I won't go into that. But one of the first programs that we did after opening and having the physical facilities, and by the way, the University of Florida TREEO Center is a unique building. It was built with poured concrete. The entire building is concrete. The walls are concrete. The roofs are concrete. The concrete discharge channel that goes to the wastewater plant is concrete. And one of the interesting things is that concrete has to be stirred or agitated sometimes to keep it from what they call honeycombing, or making an ugly look of concrete. And the only place in the whole building that had a problem was that one of the main posts made out of concrete, that the column that held the post collapsed, and they got on the very front of the building. But anyway, it's not too noticeable, and the roof of the canteen has over 200 yards of concrete in it. That just gives you some of the idea. And the walls are all concrete, except for the glass doors that open and the windows that open. And air conditioning. We use the heat exchange using water from the wastewater treatment plant. Very few people know that water has the same temperature within 1 degree plus or minus of 72 year-round. And the architects designed a green building before green was ever thought of. We had wastewater heat exchange conditioning for air and heat of the building. We had the water flowed through the building and was trapped inside of a pool inside what appeared to be inside of the building, but because of the arrangement, it was actually outside, but it had water in it, and the water created a convection and a current of air, so that if you open the windows, you'd get air through the building without causing to have air conditioning. So the coolness of the building was partly the responsibility of wastewater treatment containment. We also had a large question. Part of the request from the architects was to build a building that could be expanded without destroying the integrity of the original building. The auditorium can be expanded by taking out the projection booth area, which was a corrugated wall, and you could take it out and push the building. The building itself would not be affected by, or the structure of the building was not affected. You could add new space to the lecture hall. One of the walls and the gate, or the opening of the demonstration area, could be removed without disturbing the structure of the wall with pre-stressed concrete beams. So anyway, all of this was a unique building, and its contribution has been experimental in many ways to the community and to the state. Now, I want to go through the process of passage of the bill. After having been told to write the bill, I immediately told Mr. Turlington, I know nothing about writing a bill. He said, well, we want you just to tell the story of what you want. So I wrote the story. Bill was written and was introduced. And I went through that process, and it passed. We finally had it ready to go. And the Backflow cross-connection program began because of the first program we did was water distribution. Now, in that Backflow program, we saw a lot of mechanical equipment was used, and the next program after the first opening ceremony with the short school was to talk about repairs and maintenance of backflow prevention devices. And the device and program has specific maintenance programs and testing. These are devices that can be damaged by physical or by just simply wearing out. And consequently, it has to be tested, so there has to be test cocks on the device, and every one of the devices except the atmospheric vacuum breaker have test cocks on them. And those test cocks need testing once a year to be sure that they're functioning properly. And the building of the device and the companies that supply them supported us in the activities of the backflow device testing and repairs. Was one of the first short schools that we ran, and it was a 2-day program, and no, I'm sorry, it was 5 days. It was 5 days long, and I later adapted it in retirement to a 4-day program. That's what gets me confused when I start talking about it. But it dealt with the various kinds of devices that are available and how to repair them, how to test them, and how to install them. They have several specifications. They have to have particular height on the device that has a reduced pressure zone. The reduced pressure zone has a valve, or a check valve in it that opens up to allow water to flow out into the ground, and it has to be installed above ground so that the water will flow out in the ground. If it's broke and it had to flow, and so there's a specification for the installation of that device. The program that we ran was backflow prevention, was basically training people how to repair and operate the backflow prevention devices, how they should be installed, what their functions were in certain conditions. And one of the unique ads I have ever seen was that a vacuum breaker was controlled. They had what was called a barometric loop. If you raise the water line above the ground to a certain height, it cannot back siphon water but to a certain level, and you can't buy. And that's one form of non-mechanical backflow prevention device. And I have a picture on a slide that shows you looking through the overflow of the barometric loop and seeing an aircraft taking off through it. It looks like it's big enough for an aircraft. That's not true. It's just an optical illusion. But there are a number of ways to prevent backflow. And the training was one of the activities that the University of Florida has become as famous as the original foundation in California, which was the Southern California's Foundation for Cross-Connection Control and Backflow Prevention. And they were the originator of the first program that was concerned with preventing backflow because of the diseases from the Asian nations and people that were coming over. You could see these water pipes being hang over to and connected to the tanks on the boats. And they were sometimes backflowing and getting contamination from the bilge of the boats into the city's water. And that's why they needed the backflow protection. And that's why the development of backflow. That was not the first full notice. Backflow was noted one time at a American Water Supply Convention in Chicago back in the 1800s. They were served at the dining table water that was polluted with contaminants that were floating, different kinds of contaminants floating in the glasses of water that were poured for them. So that it's been known for a number of years, but the foundation in California was the one that developed the program. The TREEO Center is opened and has served in several capacities. It's located east of the Veterans Memorial on 63rd Street, and there's about 6 blocks that exist of 63rd that are paved. One end of it just doesn't exist. The other end is blocked off to prevent movement through what was one time a sinkhole. Now, I want to mention that there's sinkholes in the area, and that water now can be used in a clean water as a result from cleaning the water so clean that it is now potable. And the word potable is if you look at the doc, when I first got started in this program, everyone that I ever met called it potable water because it is P-O-T-A-B-L-E. And it was called potable water. And I don't know that I take pride in it, but I take some comment and make the statement that I guess I singularly, alone, forced people to change the world a bit by creating the word potable as, if you look at the diacritical marks of the word, the long O doesn't say I, it says O, potable. And so we have potable water today, and more people. In fact, if I say the other word, I have very few people that have ever heard it. And I'm glad that has happened. I guess I'm there. They had another contamination of chlorine, but it was after the law had been passed to make it not make it, but anyway, after the Safe Drinking Water Act was passed. You had to, if you see, before the Safe Drinking Water Act, if you drank water, you were doing it at your own risk, because if this is the way I treat it and I give it to you and I do the best I can, that's all you can expect out of me. That's what they did. Then they passed the Safe Drinking Water Act, and they said it had to be free and clear from contaminants up to 90% of BOD removal. Now, I at one time was confused with how to tell people what BOD 90% meant. It meant that there's, if more than 10% of the oxygen, it disappears in a jug of water overnight. More than 10%, it has over, it has more than 90%, or it has at least 90%, well, it hasn't met the 90% requirement. I used to take it from the other way, and I finally realized I'm taking it the wrong way. In other words, it had to have 90% left in it, but if it had over 10% more oxygen in it, in other words, more than 90%, up into the top 10%, it had 90% removal. In my use of the best consultant anyone has ever had, I have to call him my mentor, and that's Ralph Turlington. One of the things that happened when we passed the TREEO Center bill using the idea of a petition. People have not heard of the stories sometimes of how politics may do things quickly, or they may take years to do. But one of the things that I experienced with my contact with Mr. Turlington was one evening or one afternoon, I was sitting in a Walgreens Canova pharmacy on the corner of University Avenue and Main Street, and the lobbyist for the web industries happened to walk in, and he saw Mr. Turlington there, and I'm sitting there with him. And the gentleman said to him, he said, you know, we have Senator Shands, and we do things for him pretty much, and he pretty well helps us out when we need it. But he's having a hard time in this election year, and we don't know whether to continue our support of him or take the backing of the other candidate. And Mr. Turlington looked at him. He said, well, you know, Senator Shands is interested in the hospital, the teaching hospital in Gainesville. And if the teaching hospital was to be located in Gainesville at the University of Florida, Senator Shands would never lose another election. And no one had ever heard that, and I'm the only one that ever heard that comment, and I think it's probably the only comment that was ever made in relation to the hospital. And at the time, the hospital, Senator Shands had introduced a bill earlier in the state legislature because of a need to have a teaching hospital in Florida. His bill did not suggest Gainesville as a location. His bill only proposed a certain budget to have a study of whether or not the state of Florida had a need for a teaching hospital. That bill finally decided that the state of Florida needed a teaching hospital. The only hospital that was a medical school facility was the Jackson Memorial in Miami, and it was private, So therefore, there were no teaching hospitals for Florida students. And a person in Florida who wanted to be a doctor had a hard time getting approval from some, I don't know who they had to get approval from, but they had to get approval for entering Jackson Memorial and having some amount of tuition for the trip. Now, interestingly enough, Gainesville as a small community really at the time was not appropriate for a teaching hospital. A teaching hospital needs, for instance, at least 300 or 400 patients to do its job. And there were not 300 or 400, I'm teasing there. This is a facetious statement. There were probably not 300 or 400 people in Florida sick at any one time, except for water contamination, which did occur quite often. Fact of the matter is, when a person came to the university for summer school, they were admonished, and I'm one of those people that they told me, when you go to school up there for the summer, be prepared to stay close to the bathroom, because you will have dysentery probably about a week and a half after you enter school. And that is also true. Now, the reason that is true is because the University of Florida had promised the state of Florida free water in perpetuity, and they were giving them free water for poorly treated wastewater to irrigate the water, the land in green space on campus. And students unknowingly walked between classes, often in the spray area, and didn't know what they were walking through. Anyway, so the Gainesville is a small community, and the Medical Society of Florida had endorsed Orlando. Orlando was really not much larger, but it was a larger community and was growing and had many larger towns developing in its neighborhood. Newberry is still not very large, even though there's a movement now to build multiple housing developments around, and Newberry itself is growing, and it's becoming large enough probably to support a teaching hospital. After that remark was made, nothing else was said. I didn't understand. I noticed that the Florida Medical Society had endorsed, and it was in big almost banner headlines, they had endorsed Orlando as where the new teaching hospital that was to be built in Florida was to be located. And after that announcement, in a very short period of time, the final decision was made. And the final decision, and I feel confident that I can say the final decision was most likely made by the person who wanted Senator Shands never to lose his election, because it had become the location for the Shands Teaching Hospital. And there's one thing about the Shands Hospital that I want to talk about briefly, because it's most unusual. Shands Hospital was located, already decided where it was going to be located before they found out that that land had one of the largest underground caverns that had ever been in the state of Florida located. A decision later was made that they found 3 places that would support the weight of a hospital and far enough distance apart that it would float on those 3 levels. And they actually poured a floating slab 14 feet thick under Shands Hospital. The concrete slab of Shands Hospital is 14 feet deep. And it looked like a monkey gym with all the bars of concrete reinforcement that you saw. Now, as a side to that, several of the additions don't have that much, but they have up to 11 feet under certain parts of the teaching hospital that have taken on the roles that were never expected to be the role of Shands. Anyway, that's an interesting concept. Thank you.
I think we will close. Thank you very much, Dr. Palmer.